The sky above the city flared with a sudden, fiery light, splitting the twilight with an intensity that made the air vibrate. The ball of fire broke apart mid-air, scattering hundreds of shimmering sparks that rained down over the rooftops of the old theater, leaving no trace of smoke or debris. Time itself seemed to hesitate, as though the city had blinked and vanished for a heartbeat. The protagonist, newly arrived in the area, noticed a single silver spark on the cracked pavement. It moved of its own accord, tracing faint, luminous patterns that flickered and shifted like liquid metal. Each step he took made the ground feel unreal. The familiar sounds of the city warped, and the streetlights wavered as if caught between dimensions. The air pulsed with an unseen force, and the ordinary rules of physics began to falter. Shadows stretched in impossible angles, and reflections in windows hinted at shapes that did not exist. As he bent to touch the spark, a chill ran through him, a sensation that the very fabric of reality had thinned, inviting him into a world where logic and legend intertwined. Every instinct urged him to step back, yet an invisible thread pulled him forward, and with each passing moment, the city itself seemed to breathe, aware of his presence, setting the stage for a journey into mysteries that had waited centuries to be unveiled. The house perched on the outskirts, atop a hill that seemed to rise from the earth like a sentinel guarding the unknown. A thick mist clung to its walls, curling around the corners as if the world had conspired to conceal it from prying eyes. The windows reflected the sky in colors that were impossible to name, hues shifting subtly as though the heavens themselves had been trapped behind glass. Each pane captured a fragment of light that did not belong to the natural world, a shimmer that suggested a depth beyond ordinary perception. As the protagonist approached, the air grew heavier, filled with a tension that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The path leading to the entrance was lined with stones partially swallowed by the overgrown grass, their surfaces etched with patterns he could not decipher but somehow recognized. Inside, the house breathed. The walls bore cracks that were not merely the result of age. Faint, golden light seeped through them, casting irregular patterns across the floor. The floorboards themselves protested under his weight, groaning in low tones that resonated through the rooms, as if the structure had a memory and remembered each footstep that had ever crossed its threshold. In some places, the boards seemed almost liquid, yielding slightly, then stiffening again as he passed, giving the sense that the house was aware of him, measuring him, and adjusting around his presence. The air was thick, rich with a mixture of scents that defied categorization. Moist earth after rain, salty tang of a distant ocean, faint smoke from an invisible hearth, and something else, ancient and metallic, that hinted at secrets buried within the foundations. The protagonist moved from room to room, and each space revealed a world within a world. One room stretched endlessly, walls covered in dense greenery that shimmered with dew, the floor soft and damp beneath his feet. The ceiling was alive with a faint rustling, like wind whispering through branches, and from the shadows emerged the flicker of small, phosphorescent creatures moving with deliberate grace, vanishing when he attempted to focus on them. Another room was drenched in pale silver light, as if moonlight had been captured and poured across the sanded floor. Waves lapped silently along the edges of a miniature shore, and the scent of brine filled the air. He could hear the soft rhythm of the ocean, a pulse in time with something deeper, something beneath the ordinary heartbeat of the world outside. The contrast between rooms was disorienting. Stepping through a doorway was akin to stepping through reality itself, and each threshold brought a new perception of what the universe could contain. The furniture in the house seemed to retain echoes of past lives. Chairs creaked under his touch, as though protesting his intrusion. Tables bore scratches that told stories in a language he could almost understand, and shelves sagged under the weight of books that emitted faint, almost imperceptible hums. On one wall, a portrait hung crookedly, a depiction of a figure with eyes that shifted when he looked away. The expression on the figure's face changed subtly over time, from curiosity to amusement to faint sorrow, creating an unsettling impression that he was being silently observed, studied, and perhaps even judged. As he ventured further, the architecture itself began to challenge his understanding. Corridors twisted unnaturally, doors opened into spaces that contradicted physical laws, and staircases led to upper floors that seemed impossibly high, stretching beyond the visible ceiling. In some hallways, the floor would tilt slightly, forcing him to adjust his balance in ways that felt unnatural, yet not entirely uncomfortable. Sounds traveled strangely here, echoing before they arrived and sometimes lingering long after they should have faded. The atmosphere was alive with an unnameable intelligence, a presence that was patient and watchful, waiting for him to uncover the house's truths at its own pace. Light behaved oddly within the rooms. Beams entering through cracked windows refracted into colors that did not exist in any spectrum he knew. Shadows moved independently of objects, stretching, shrinking, and sometimes separating entirely to drift across walls in ways that suggested intent. In one room, a chandelier swayed gently despite the absence of air movement, scattering fragments of light like stars caught in slow orbit. On the floor, dust motes glowed faintly, arranging themselves into fleeting, intricate patterns before dissolving into nothingness. The house was not merely inhabited by the past, it was a living canvas where time, memory, and imagination intertwined. Outside, the mist thickened, curling into shapes that almost resembled figures, watching, waiting, and sometimes vanishing when approached. The hill beneath the house seemed to pulse, a subtle rise and fall that mirrored the rhythm of something hidden beneath the earth. Trees around the property leaned inwards, their branches moving in patterns that mimicked the motion of waves, and the wind carried whispers that seemed to echo the voices of those who had once entered the house and never left entirely. The protagonist felt the weight of those untold histories pressing down, as if the hill itself remembered, and the house was the archive of all who had passed through it. In the central room, he discovered a mirror unlike any other. Its surface rippled faintly, as though water had been frozen mid-motion. Looking into it, he did not see only his reflection. He glimpsed fleeting images of the rooms he had yet to explore, shadows of people who had been there before, and landscapes that defied geographic sense. The mirror seemed to breathe with the house, expanding and contracting subtly. And as he leaned closer, the silver spark from the falling star appeared, hovering just above its surface. It pulsed gently, as if communicating through light, a language he had not yet learned to read, but felt he understood instinctively. Hours, or perhaps moments, passed indistinguishably. The protagonist wandered, touched, and observed, aware that every sensation was magnified, every sound amplified, every scent laden with meaning. He realized that leaving would not be as simple as walking out the door. The house demanded acknowledgement, a recognition of its presence and the mysteries it contained. In that recognition, he felt a shift within himself, a merging of curiosity, fear, and awe that would shape his perception of reality forever. Each room had its own personality, each corridor its own mood, and each whisper of wind carried knowledge older than any living memory. By the time he reached the attic, the mist outside had cleared slightly, revealing a distant view of the city lights, small and fragile in the dark, but alive. The contrast between the vibrant human world below and the house's alien, suspended reality created a dizzying effect. He understood that the house was a threshold, a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary intersected, and that its secrets would not yield easily. The attic contained a symbol window, through which he could see the stars beginning to emerge, each one reflecting faintly on the glass surface like tiny sparks of the falling star. The house seemed to acknowledge him, a silent pact forming between the living and the spaces beyond ordinary perception. An unspoken invitation to continue the journey into the unknown, where legends and reality coexisted, and where the ordinary rules of existence were suspended indefinitely. In every corner, every shadow, and every glimmer of light, the protagonist felt the pulse of the house as if it were a living organism. Time moved differently here, measured not by minutes or hours, but by moments of revelation, fear, and awe. The journey through the house was not just exploration, it was immersion into a world where imagination shaped reality, and where the house itself was a story unfolding, breathing, and waiting for him to write the next chapter. In the heart of the city's old library, the protagonist discovered a hidden staircase, narrow and twisting, descending into shadows that seemed older than the building itself. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated in the slanting light from above, creating streaks that looked almost solid. The staircase led to an underground archive, a vaulted chamber, lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of forgotten history. Ancient scrolls, brittle papers, and folded notes lay scattered on tables and stacked in haphazard piles, each one covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs that shivered whenever he moved. The air was heavy, scented with aged parchment, ink, and a faint metallic tang that suggested something more than decay lingered in the darkness. The documents contained chronicles of the city's past, some dating back more than a century. They described disappearances of citizens, unexplained phenomena, and shadows that were said to have moved independently, following people through streets and alleys at night. The records hinted at beings that looked human at first glance, but whose eyes glowed in the darkness, and whose presence was accompanied by a strange silence, a momentary stillness that swallowed all ordinary sounds. The writing on some scrolls shifted subtly as he read, letters elongating, bending, and reassembling into symbols that seemed almost alive, as if the words themselves resisted his comprehension while simultaneously drawing him closer. As he moved among the shelves, a faint vibration seemed to emanate from the floor, resonating through his feet and up into his chest. Shadows in the corners of the archive appeared to stretch and curl toward him, yet when he turned, they receded like mist. Each scroll he lifted sent shivers down his spine, and the brush of paper against his fingers felt electric, as though the history recorded within was aware of his presence. Some of the pages depicted creatures whose forms twisted between human and something unearthly, their eyes capturing the dim light and reflecting it in a way that suggested consciousness, as though they watched him in return. The atmosphere was saturated with a sense of being observed. A subtle pressure weighed on his shoulders, not physical but cognitive, a feeling that each movement he made, each breath, was part of a vast and patient reckoning. Occasionally, a faint whisper drifted through the air, so quiet it could have been imagined, yet it resonated in his chest, repeating fragments of the stories written on the scrolls. He realized the archive itself was a living entity, its essence intertwined with the records it preserved, protecting secrets not merely through concealment, but through an active awareness of anyone who dared to intrude. The further he ventured, the stranger the space became. Shelves curved imperceptibly, creating passages that seemed longer than the rooms themselves, hallways that doubled back into unexpected corners, and doors that led to empty, echoing chambers. Scrolls on tables seemed to shift positions when he glanced away, and symbols occasionally rearranged themselves in patterns that resembled constellations, maps, or warnings. A chill wind, imperceptible in origin, occasionally brushed his skin, carrying the faint scent of the ocean or the forest, transporting him momentarily out of the confines of the archive and into memory itself. Time in the archive behaved strangely. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Shadows deepened, then receded, and light from above altered subtly, casting patterns that seemed meaningful only when viewed fleetingly. He felt as if he were moving through the consciousness of the city itself, guided and observed simultaneously. Every document he examined left an impression on him, a subtle resonance in his thoughts, as if the city's history had brushed against the edges of his own mind. Each creature depicted, each glowing eye, and each shifting symbol was a reminder that the line between observer and observed was blurred, and that his presence here was already woven into the tapestry of the archive. In every corner, every shadow, and every glimmer of light, the protagonist felt the pulse of the house as if it were a living organism. Time moved differently here, measured not by minutes or hours, but by moments of revelation, fear, and awe. The journey through the house was not just exploration. It was immersion into a world where imagination shaped reality, and where the house itself was a story unfolding, breathing, and waiting for him to write the next chapter. By the time he ascended the staircase back to the library, the glow of day had shifted, but the sensation of being watched lingered. The scrolls had returned to their resting places, the shadows had receded, yet he felt that the keepers of the records were aware of him, waiting for him to act, to remember, or to return. The archive had imparted knowledge and unease in equal measure, leaving the protagonist with the realization that history in this city was not inert, that the past was alive, and that anyone who trespassed into its depths would carry its presence forever. Upon returning to the house on the hill, the protagonist immediately sensed that the interior had transformed. Corridors stretched far beyond their previous length, twisting and narrowing before opening into rooms that seemed to occupy impossible angles. Walls bowed and flexed as if breathing, and mirrors reflected shapes that did not exist in the physical space, figures with shifting features that flickered at the edge of perception. The shadows moved with a life of their own, crawling along the floor, climbing the walls, and pooling in corners, forming intricate patterns that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who dared observe them closely. Light entering through the windows fell at odd angles, casting the floors in shimmering reflections that resembled water. Within these mirrored surfaces, objects were distorted, and glimpses of the past appeared momentarily, replaying fragments of events long forgotten. A chair might show the outline of someone sitting, or a staircase would flicker with figures ascending or descending in silent motion, vanishing when approached. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and unease, each breath heavy, each step uncertain, as if the house itself were testing him. The protagonist noticed that the boundaries between rooms were inconsistent. A doorway that had led to a small study now opened into a vast hall, and corridors seemed to loop back impossibly, defying logic. The very air felt charged, vibrating with the presence of unseen watchers. Occasionally, the softest echo of footsteps or distant whispers suggested companions moving alongside him, yet each time he turned, there was only emptiness. The sensation of being observed intensified, as though invisible forces gauged his courage and composure, probing the edges of his perception and dragging his mind into uncertainty. In one chamber, the light created the illusion of liquid surfaces, reflecting not only the furniture and walls, but subtle traces of memory. Shadows played along these reflective floors, forming shapes that seemed to narrate silent stories of the house's past inhabitants. The protagonist could feel the weight of generations pressing subtly against him, the energy of forgotten lives condensed into patterns of light and darkness. The longer he remained, the more tenuous his grip on ordinary perception became. Sounds, shapes, and even gravity seemed inconsistent, bending under the will of some unseen intelligence embedded in the house. Every step through the labyrinth demanded vigilance. Shadows coalesced into semi-recognizable forms that disappeared when he tried to focus on them, leaving only the lingering sense of an unfinished motion. Occasionally, a mirror would reflect his own figure, yet subtly altered. Longer limbs, distorted features, or the faint glint of eyes that did not belong to him. The house seemed to test him, probing his awareness, daring him to trust his own senses while simultaneously undermining them. Each room, hallway, and mirrored surface was a puzzle, a challenge to his resolve, forcing him to confront the possibility that reality itself was malleable within these walls. Time passed unevenly. Moments stretched into eternities, and then collapsed suddenly, leaving him disoriented, unsure of how long he had wandered. The house whispered through the patterns of shadow and light, its messages unintelligible yet undeniable, pressing on his mind with both menace and revelation. The protagonist felt that every decision, every hesitation was recorded by these unseen keepers of the labyrinth, shaping the path ahead in ways he could not anticipate. With each step, he became increasingly aware that the boundary between legend and reality was no longer clear. He was inside a living myth, and the house itself was both judge and guide, testing not only his courage, but the very integrity of his perception. The labyrinth of shadows stretched endlessly, corridors looping back upon themselves, rooms folding into impossible geometries, and mirrors reflecting past, present, and potential futures all at once. The protagonist moved with caution and growing awareness that the house was not merely a location, but a sentient space, a guardian of mysteries that defied logic. Every reflection, every whisper of movement, every curling shadow was part of the trial, and with each step, he realized that leaving the house unscathed or unchanged might be impossible, that he had entered a domain where reality itself bent to the will of memory, myth, and the invisible forces that had always inhabited the hilltop home. By the time he ascended the staircase back to the library, the glow of day had shifted, but the sensation of being watched lingered. The scrolls had returned to their resting places, the shadows had receded, yet he felt that the keepers of the records were aware of him, waiting for him to act, to remember, or to return. The archive had imparted knowledge and unease in equal measure, leaving the protagonist with the realization that history in this city was not inert, that the past was alive, and that anyone who trespassed into its depths would carry its presence forever. The storm rose suddenly, tearing through the city with relentless force. Winds howled like wild beasts, bending and breaking trees, while rain transformed streets into rushing torrents that swept away debris and reflected the flickering light of lightning in puddles and rivers along the asphalt. The protagonist struggled to find shelter, but each instinctive turn seemed directed by some unseen hand, guiding him toward the heart of the city, where the central square lay under the shadow of an ancient sculpture. Its surface was etched with symbols strikingly similar to those he had seen in the hidden archives, intricate markings that seemed to pulse faintly under the flashes of lightning. The rain and wind combined with drifting sand from the outskirts of the city, creating a surreal haze that animated the empty buildings. Windows glimmered as though catching ghosts of the past, and lampposts bent under the force of the storm seemed to sway rhythmically, casting elongated, dancing shadows that stretched across the square like living entities. The protagonist felt each gust of wind push him forward, each crack of thunder echoing with a resonance that seemed almost communicative, a language of the storm itself calling him onward. Amid the chaos, he became aware of subtle, almost imperceptible whispers rising above the roar of the elements. They wove through the pounding rain, carrying tones that felt older than the city, voices that invoked forgotten rituals and obscure promises etched into stone and memory. They spoke not in words, but in rhythms and tonalities, pulling at something deep within him, urging him toward the sculpture. Each step felt heavier, charged with an energy that made the air around him vibrate, and the wet ground seemed to pulse beneath his feet as though alive. Lightning arced across the sky in unnatural patterns, illuminating the sculpture in sudden bursts that revealed details otherwise hidden in shadow. Carvings shifted in the flashes, seeming to animate momentarily, the symbols twisting and writhing as though the stone itself were breathing. In these moments, the buildings surrounding the square appeared to move subtly, corners stretching, doorways lengthening, and rooftops undulating under the storm's influence, creating the impression that the city itself had become a living maze. The storm's power was overwhelming, yet it felt purposeful, as if orchestrated to bring the protagonist exactly where he needed to be. The protagonist's senses were assaulted by the combination of wind, rain, sand, and sound. Every shadow seemed to have depth and intent. Every reflection in puddles revealed fleeting glimpses of shapes not his own. He realized that the storm was not merely meteorological, but a convergence of forces beyond ordinary comprehension, an awakening of the city's hidden layers. It was as if the boundaries between reality and legend were collapsing, and he was being drawn into the core of a secret that had slumbered for generations. As he reached the sculpture, the wind whipped violently around him, bending him almost to the ground, and yet the area around the monument remained strangely clear, as if a protective force had carved a pocket of space within the storm. The symbols on the sculpture seemed to hum faintly, resonating with the whispers that coursed through the square. For a brief, terrifying instant, the storm paused in a tense equilibrium. Raindrops hung suspended in the air, the clouds froze, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a roar, the storm's energy shifted, plunging the square into a vortex of motion, light, and sound, signaling the arrival of an event far older and more mysterious than the protagonist had ever imagined. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet he remained rooted, drawn by a force that was neither malevolent nor benevolent, but utterly inevitable. The night sky cracked open in lightning that etched strange geometric patterns across the clouds, casting spectral light over the city. Shadows within the square began to stretch and merge with the symbols on the sculpture, forming shapes that seemed alive, entities half seen at the periphery of vision, their presence both threatening and mesmerizing. The storm, though destructive, revealed hidden layers of reality, as if the city had finally unveiled its secret heart. In the midst of the tempest, the protagonist realized that this night would forever alter his perception of the world. The storm was a threshold, a trial not of strength, but of awareness and courage, testing his ability to confront the unknown and witness truths hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. The city, drenched and chaotic, became a stage for forces that had slumbered for centuries, and the night storm was the herald, the moment when reality trembled and legend stepped into the waking world, leaving the protagonist suspended between fear, awe, and the irresistible pull of discovery. Morning brought an uncanny calm, the storm vanishing as abruptly as it had arisen, leaving the city drenched in silence and an almost surreal stillness. The protagonist stepped into the central square, where only moments before the sculpture had stood, and found it gone, replaced by a perfectly still pool of water that covered the ground like liquid glass. The surface reflected the sky with extraordinary clarity, yet it shimmered with a strange inner light, color shifting subtly as though the water itself was alive and breathing. He noticed that the reflections were not limited to the present. Fleeting glimpses of figures from centuries past flickered beneath the surface, the silhouettes of those who had vanished, their forms frozen mid-motion yet strangely vibrant, as if trapped between time and memory. As he approached, the air itself seemed heavier, charged with a tension that was neither threatening nor comforting, but profoundly significant. The whispers from the storm had transformed into something more enduring, resonating from the water itself, a chorus of voices bound to the reflections. The protagonist felt the pull of something immense and ancient, a presence that extended beyond understanding, urging recognition and acceptance. The pull responded to his attention. As he focused, a phrase appeared on the mirrored surface, burned into the light with an intensity that seared his vision. The oath must not be broken. The gravity of the message settled into him with absolute clarity. He understood that the events of the past night, the storm, the shifting city, the labyrinthine shadows, and the symbols etched in stone in memory were all part of a continuum that bound him to the city's unseen history. His presence had become another layer of the legend, another story woven into the fabric of a reality that no longer adhered to conventional rules. Every person who came to this square in the future would see only the city and the still mirror of water, but the spectral whispers of the past would remain, waiting for those attuned enough to perceive them. Time itself seemed to dissolve around the pool. Minutes stretched and contracted unpredictably, each reflection revealing fragments of forgotten moments, tragedies, and fleeting joys from the lives of those long gone. The protagonist realized that the water acted as both witness and recorder, preserving the echoes of the past in a delicate equilibrium with the present. To disturb it would be to violate the oath, a boundary set by forces older than the city, older than memory itself. He stood silently, feeling the weight of the unseen observers and the continuity of the story. A wind stirred briefly, ruffling the water's surface, yet not a single drop broke the mirror-like stillness. In that moment, he comprehended the permanence of the city's enchantment. The storm had been a catalyst, revealing the hidden architecture of the past and present, and the pool of water was the anchor of its legacy. The echoes of those who had vanished were no longer mere legends. They existed here, in this reflected liminality, and he was irrevocably part of it. With the rising sun, the city resumed a deceptive normalcy. Streets glistened under the soft light. Buildings appeared intact, and the air smelled of rain and ozone. Yet the protagonist knew nothing would ever return to ordinary form. He could walk among the city's streets as others did, yet the mirrored water would continue to whisper truths to those who dared look deeper. An eternal reminder that the past and the mystical had fused irrevocably with the present. He had become both witness and participant, and the oath remained, unbroken, eternal, and inescapable. The reflection of the sky rippled faintly, and for a fleeting second, he glimpsed himself as one of the silhouettes, tethered to the history of the city and bound by the water's oath. The square remained tranquil to casual observers, yet its surface contained the weight of centuries, the unresolved mysteries of countless lives, and the subtle but unrelenting call for recognition. The protagonist understood that the city, the pool, and the whispers were a living legend, and that those who arrived later would encounter only the surface, unaware of the depths and the inexorable consequences of the oath that could never be broken.